I am Dr. Michael Bogart, designer of this Big Picture Bible Overview course. I am so glad that you've joined us. You know, in my nearly 50 years of ministry and teaching experience, I've noticed that fewer and fewer people know very much at all about the Bible. Some people today have such a negative view of the Bible that they either feel that the Bible isn't relevant or that it's actually mean, hateful, and intolerant. Even Christians and Jews who practice their faith consistently may only know the Bible in bits and pieces. A very small minority of people understand just how the parts of the Bible fit together from beginning to end. In this course, we're going to try to fix that problem. If you stay with me to the end, you can look forward to gaining a broad, big picture grasp of the Bible and how it speaks to the world that we live in. When you finish this course, you'll probably be far more knowledgeable in the Bible than almost anyone that you may know. You may even become the local Bible expert in your circle of family, friends, and acquaintances. I hope you are ready for this exciting journey into God's Word. I know I am. So let's get started. This is the first module, Module A. The first lesson in this module will focus on the Bible itself, how it was written, how it was put together, and what it's based on. Lesson 2 and following will cover the book of Genesis. Now, I don't want to take anything for granted. Students in this course come to it with different experiences of the Bible, from very little experience with it to a whole lot. So let's begin this lesson in a basic way by talking about the two sections of the Christian Bible, the Old Testament and the New Testament. Christians and Jews share that body of Scripture called the Old Testament. That's what the Christians call it. Jews call it the Hebrew Scriptures or the Tanakh. Sometimes they just refer to it as the Torah, which is technically only the first 5 books of it, the books of Moses from Genesis to Deuteronomy. We'll talk more about that later. The Old Testament focuses on God's dealings with the people of ancient Israel. Christians add the New Testament to our Bible, which we believe fulfills and completes the Old Testament. The New Testament focuses on God's redemption of the entire world through Jesus Christ, the Son of God and the Messiah of Israel. In this course, we will be looking at the Bible from a Christian point of view. One of the first questions that must be settled is, who wrote the Bible? Well, there were at least 40 different human writers, possibly more than that. Besides Moses, who wrote the first books, other prominent authors will include David, who wrote many of the Psalms, Solomon, who wrote and collected the Proverbs, as well as prophets like Isaiah, Jeremiah, and Ezekiel. These and others authored the books of the Old Testament. The New Testament, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John composed the Gospels. The book of Acts, the New Testament letters, and Revelation were written by a variety of authors: Luke, Paul, Peter, John, Jude, and others perhaps. So there were quite a few human writers working over a span of hundreds of years. The final product is an amazing, harmonious account of how God moves in the world to redeem the human race. Now, how could books written over such a long time by so many people fit together so well? Well, it's because these writers were inspired, guided by God's Spirit in their writing. Passages like 2 Timothy 3:16 and 17 and 1 Peter 1:20 and 21 describe the process. They reveal that the human authors clearly had their specific reasons for writing. They shared their own thoughts and their own experiences. They used grammar and words of their own choosing. Yet, God oversaw their lives and their thought processes so that what they wrote reflected His will and message. The Bible account relates how God has been redeeming the world through the family of Abraham and the people of Israel, and it climaxed in the coming of the Messiah, Jesus Christ. The message of the apostles is the good news, or gospel, that God offers redemption to everyone from every tribe, kindred, and nation on earth, and that He will someday wipe away all vestiges of evil from His creation. So before we talk about when the Bible books were written, we need to take a few minutes to talk about how we count time. In every lesson, we're going to be talking about time using the BC and AD time designations. So I want to make sure that we understand how all of that works. Now you're probably familiar with the terms BC and AD. But what do those terms mean and how does the system actually work? Well, I made a quick video a few years ago on YouTube that explains how our time designations work. As I said a few minutes ago, I don't want to take anything for granted. So let's do a bit of review just to make sure that everyone is on the same page, so to speak. All right, let's watch. What's up with this whole BC and AD thing when it comes to organizing the years of world history? I mean, the epics of our time, the way we organize them. These time designations can be a bit confusing when you come across them in documentaries or reading. And of course, most of the time we don't use either designation because we're talking about relatively recent events. For instance, the Declaration of Independence was signed in 1776. World War II ended in 1945, and the Twin Towers disaster occurred in 2001, and so on. So when speaking of events like these, we don't use either the BC or the AD because every year for the past 2,000 years or so is in the AD epoch. And in the AD epoch, each year the number increases by 1. So the year after 2001 was 2002, and so on. Very simple, right? But the further back in time you go, and suddenly the years are counted differently. There are actually two differences. First, the designation changes from AD to BC, and second, the BC numbers increase the further back in time the event occurred. Confused? Well, let me explain. Well, let's start with what BC and AD actually stand for. BC is pretty self-explanatory. It just means before Christ. In other words, the years before Jesus Christ lived. So theoretically, 100 years before the time of Jesus would be 100 BC. 1,000 years before Jesus would then be 1,000 BC, and so on. Well, how about AD? Many people would say that AD stands for after the death or after the death of Christ. But that's incorrect. AD actually stands for Anno Domini, which is Latin and means year of the Lord. In other words, AD means the years since the birth of Jesus Christ. Now, I know that's pretty inconsistent. One term is English and the other one's Latin. And to be consistent, you would think that they would both be in the same language. But then again, no one ever accused English of being consistent. So let's visualize how this works. The traditional date given, for example, for the founding of Rome in antiquity is around 750 BC. On a timeline, it would fall about here. Well, how about the reign of King David in the Old Testament? That would be around 1000 BC or here on the timeline. Next, let's take the birth of Jesus. Theoretically, that would fall about here on the timeline, between AD and BC. How about the date for the fall of the Roman Empire in the West? Let's say AD 475. That's about here on the timeline. Now let's take the familiar date for Columbus landing in America, AD 1492, which would be about here. See how the system works? Just one more twist to complicate things even further. Now you would think that Jesus would have been born in the year 0. But there is no year 0. 1 BC is followed directly by 1 AD, and Jesus was not born in either 1 BC or 1 AD. Most likely he was born around 4 or 5 BC. Why? Well, it's because Dionysius the Humble, Dionysius was the monk who devised our current Gregorian calendar, Dionysius was mistaken in his calculations for the date of Jesus' birth by several years. Now, Dionysius may have been a saint, but he obviously stunk at math. Well, how do we know about this? Well, you may recall that Herod the Great met with the wise men in their search for the baby Jesus. So Herod was clearly alive when Jesus was born. But Herod died in late 4 BC. So Jesus must have been born sometime before that, in early 4 BC, or maybe even a year or two before that. So that's it. Time is divided by the life of Christ, sort of. The years before that have larger numbers the further back you go and are called BC, before Christ. The years since Jesus' birth have larger numbers the closer they get to our own time, and they're called AD, Anno Domini, the year of the Lord. All right, when were the books of the Bible written? For centuries, Jews and Christians have believed that Moses wrote the first books of the Old Testament, perhaps as far back as 1500 BC. The final books of the Old Testament were composed in the late 400s BC. Shortly thereafter, Ezra the priest compiled the entire collection. So there were at least 1,000 years from Moses to Ezra. The Old Testament that many of us are familiar with contains a total of 39 books, although Roman Catholic and Eastern Orthodox Christians include an extra section to the Old Testament, and that's called the Apocrypha. How about the New Testament? The books of the New Testament were written in the latter half of the 1st century AD. The first books may possibly have been written as early as 45 AD, although a lot of scholars would place these earlier books a few years after that, into the 50s. Mark may have been the first gospel account. The books of James and Galatians seem to be the earliest letters written. The final books were completed by the Apostle John in the late 90s of the 1st century AD. These include the Gospel of John, the 3 letters of John, and the book of Revelation. So the total of New Testament books is 27, which all branches of Christianity accept as authentic and inspired. Of course, Judaism does not include the New Testament in their scriptures. Why? Because they do not accept Jesus as their Messiah. Now keep in mind that the order of the books in the Bible is not necessarily in time sequence. Both the Old and New Testaments are organized into categories or types of books. So don't expect the books to follow a time sequence from beginning to end. For example, the book of Job is one of the oldest books in the Bible, but it appears in the middle of the Old Testament. The Old Testament is organized into several sections. First, books of law written by Moses. That's Genesis through Deuteronomy. Scholars call the books of law the Pentateuch. Jews call these books Torah. There are the prophetic books like Isaiah, Jeremiah, Daniel, and others. The Hebrew word for prophets is Nevi'im. Then there are the books of history like Samuel, Kings, Chronicles, and so on, as well as the poetry and wisdom books like Psalms, Proverbs, and the others. Jews call these miscellaneous writings Ketubim. So as a sort of shorthand, Jews often take the first letters of each of the Hebrew words for the 3 sections, T and K, to make up a new term for the entire Hebrew scriptures, Tanakh. Instead of 3, Christians usually divide the Old Testament into 4 sections: law, history, poetry, wisdom, and prophets. The New Testament is organized into Gospels, the book of Acts, the New Testament letters, and the book of Revelation, which of course is in a category all by itself. Traditionally, the way that Jews preserved and copied the Torah was in scroll format. Scrolls similar to the one that you see were discovered in 1947 in the Dead Sea Scroll collection. This collection has the most ancient copies of the Old Testament in existence, and it proves that there have been no significant copy mistakes or changes in the Old Testament since Ezra compiled it in the 400s BC. Now remember, the Dead Sea Scrolls are the earliest copies that we have. The originals, as far as we know, don't exist. They may have crumbled into dust many, many centuries ago. So what we have to go on are the early copies of the Old Testament. And what the Dead Sea Scrolls did was they proved that all of the copies made from the time of the Dead Sea Scrolls, which would be as far back as 200 BC, to modern times, there have been almost 0 copy mistakes. Any mistakes or any changes or any differences are extremely minimal. No theological concepts are compromised. No ideas are changed. And that's a huge thing. We can trust our Old Testament. And of course, the New Testament is even better in terms of its proof. If you were to visit a synagogue today, what you would see used in the ceremony is a scroll like that one. For study purposes, though, Jews tend to read it in book form as Christians do. Okay, what were the original languages of the Bible? The Old Testament was written in ancient Hebrew. Although a couple of its later portions were written in a related language called Aramaic, 99% of the Old Testament is Hebrew. The language of the New Testament is Koine Greek, which was the trade and educational language common in the ancient world. And by the way, Koine Greek means common Greek. For centuries, both before and after the time of Christ, you could do business in Greek from as far west as Spain, eastward all the way through the Middle East, almost to the borders of India. So choosing to record the scriptures in Greek was a very smart move on the part of the early church. They understood that they could reach the maximum amount of people if they did that. Also, ancient Greek is an ideal language in discussing abstract and complicated thoughts and ideas. That makes Greek the perfect language to explain theological concepts like who Jesus is by nature, aspects of God's plan of redemption, and many other concepts like that. So Hebrew for the Old Testament and Greek for the New Testament. I want to close this lesson by looking at a map with some basic features of the Old Testament world. In this course, we'll be looking at maps frequently, so each one of them will be tailored to the lesson that it's attached to. All right, let's start with this map of the Old Testament geographic features. These are some general places that you will encounter, especially in the early parts of the Old Testament. So we'll begin at the upper right-hand corner of the map. There you will see an arrow pointing north toward Mount Ararat, which is, of course, located now in eastern Turkey on the border with Armenia. Imagine, if you will, the descendants of Noah coming from Mount Ararat south down out of the mountains, following the course of those two rivers that you see on the map, the Tigris to the east and the Euphrates to the west. Both of these are major rivers, and they run through what is today Turkey, Syria, and Iraq. And of course, those two rivers mark the general borders of a region called Mesopotamia. Mesopotamia in Greek is the land between the rivers. The Greeks gave names to a lot of the places that they conquered. Meso is between, Potamos is river, so Mesopotamia is the land between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers. And this is going to figure heavily as a region in the latter parts of the Old Testament. All right, moving west or to the left on the map, you will see the Mediterranean Sea. That little speck of light blue toward the top center of the map is the Sea of Galilee, and of course that's not too far from the Mediterranean Sea itself. The Sea of Galilee is a very small lake, only 7 miles across by 13 miles in length, or 11 kilometers by 21 kilometers. The Jordan River flows out of its south end some 150 miles or 250 kilometers, and it eventually empties into the Dead Sea. The Dead Sea is larger, around 10 miles wide by around 70 miles long, or 16 kilometers by 113 kilometers in length. The Dead Sea is 1,400 feet below sea level, that's 430 meters, and it has no outlet, which is why it's full of minerals. Because it has no outlet, the sun evaporates the water, leaving it full of those minerals. And you can actually float. In fact, it's very difficult to sink in the Dead Sea. I have been on the shores of the Dead Sea. I have never floated in it. But while I was there, some of the other people in our party did float in the Dead Sea, including my son. And they said the worst part was it just stings your eyes almost unbearably if you let the water in. Now, off to the right of the Jordan River is another river called the Jabbok in the Old Testament, or Yarmuk, and that flows to the west and empties into the Jordan. To the extreme left, you'll see Egypt down in the bottom left corner with another huge river called the Nile. The Nile is the longest river in the world, flowing from south to north, and it empties into the Mediterranean Sea. The bottom left of the map is the Red Sea with its two northern arms. The left or northwest arm borders on Egypt proper, and the right-hand arm is the Gulf of Aqaba. At the bottom of the map, I have marked two places that are potential locations for Mount Sinai. I say potential because the traditional Mount Sinai is the one to the left, and it's located in the Sinai Peninsula. Then there's an alternative site that Westerners are becoming more aware of recently, and I think it's much more biblically accurate. It is located in modern-day northwest Saudi Arabia. On the map, it's the one to the right. Both of them have question marks because there's not a lot of consensus as to which is the correct one. We'll talk more about Mount Sinai when we cover the Exodus. Of course, central to the early portions of the Old Testament is the land of Canaan, just to the left of center on the map, and it borders the eastern shore of the Mediterranean Sea. Okay, that's enough for Lesson 1. You may want to review the notes, complete the learning exercises, or listen to the lesson again before taking the Lesson 1 quiz. We'll see you in Lesson 2 of this module.